All right, so now we want to talk about a little bit of chapter 17, in particular, um, what we call microevolution or the evolution of populations, and then the next page, macroevolution or speciation. So, indeed, when we talk about evolution sort of on the shorter term, smaller scale, we're talking about change within a population or a species, and we can refer to this again as microevolution. Um, and it kind of got notions of studying this got started in the early 20th century, around the 1920s, during what became known as the new synthesis. And this was when Darwin's ideas on evolution and Mendel's studies of genetics were brought together, genetics. Because even though Darwin and Mendel were contemporaries, they were alive at the same time, they were in different parts of Europe, spoke different languages, and really were not aware of each other's work. In fact, Mendel's work really was not fully appreciated until after he had died, where, of course, Darwin was quite famous during his life. But it was in the 20s when scientists, when biologists, evolutionary biologists, brought the ideas of evolution and genetics together and um, realized that essentially natural selection, as described by Darwin, acts on the phenotype, um, and as we might get from Mendel's work, the phenotype is an expression of the genotype. So the genes, the combination of genes you have determine your phenotype, and then it's the phenotype upon which natural selection or evolution acts. So essentially, natural selection acts indirectly on the genotype. And so here's a hypothetical example given in our book of a mouse population, and there are different kinds of mice. There are black ones and brown ones. You can see that the black ones are the dominant ones because the heterozygotes are black. To be brown, you have to have two copies of the brown gene, so we could think about it this way. These individuals have the black phenotype, and these individuals have the brown. Okay. Um, when you look at the population overall, of course, the brown individuals have two copies of the brown allele. Black individuals can have either two copies of the black or one black and one brown. Um, and you can essentially, by looking at the population and the proportion of homozygotes of each type and heterozygotes, you can calculate the frequency of the different alleles. And so in this population, you can see we have a 10 by 5 grid. So there's essentially 50 alleles in the population. Each individual has two alleles, so that means we have 25 individuals in the population. 36% of them are homozygous for the brown allele, so that's 25 times 0.36, which means that there are 9 individuals that are little b. And so of the 25, 48% of them are heterozygous, which equals 12 that are big B, little b. And essentially the remainder, or whoops, what the heck just happened there? 25 times 0.16, which equals 4 individuals that are big B, big B. And so you can see the distribution of the different genotypes. And so from this, you can calculate the allele frequencies. And if you look at the grid, you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. 30 of the alleles are of the little b, and that would mean 20 of the alleles are the big B, and so of course 30 divided by 50 equals 0.6. So essentially 0.6 or 60% are little b, which would mean 40% are big B in this population. So that would be the allele frequency for this population. Also what we could refer to as the gene pool for the population, the combination of different forms of the gene that you have in this population. Now, of course, this is just a particular gene, but if you looked at all the genes and all the forms or alleles of those genes, you get basically the gene pool. And the gene pool for populations can vary a great deal. For example, the gene pool of the population of Japan is probably a bit different than the gene pool of, say, Panama or Kenya or something like that. Now, these allele frequencies can change through time if selection favors particular alleles or another. For example, let's say this population lives in a forest where it's relatively dark. So you can see the majority of the individuals have the dark form. But let's say a subset of them moves out to live in the sand dunes where they're more exposed and they basically have a brown background. You can imagine a situation where the allele frequencies can change to favor the brown individuals. And because brown individuals just have little b, if selection is strong enough, you could even have a situation where in that subpopulation that lives out in the dunes has none of the big B's around and everyone is little b, so essentially the frequency of the alleles changes quite a bit. There we go. Between those two populations, from 60% or 40% of the big B around to essentially none of it being around. So allele frequencies can change, and that is basically the most simple definition of microevolution, a change in allele frequencies in a population over time, as shown in this example with these beetles, where at one generation there was 75% of the green allele. The next generation it decreases a little bit. Not a significant change, but a change nonetheless, and what you would define as microevolution. So again, alleles are forms of genes. Where do new alleles come from? Well, mutations. These mutations can create new alleles, which can increase genetic variation. Here's a rather absurd example where a mutation causes this fly to, instead of having antenna, it has legs sticking out of its head. Probably not a terribly advantageous mutation, but one nonetheless. Because variation is sort of needed for populations to evolve, because think about it, if a population has no variation, selection really can't operate because the individuals either survive or they don't. There's not variation in the population with differences in survival. So essentially mutations are sometimes described as the raw material of evolution. They provide the material upon which evolution or natural selection can act. Now, genetic variation is generated through sexual reproduction and the recombination that occurs there, because you'll remember during meiosis, crossing over occurs, and you're not creating new alleles, but you're putting alleles into new combinations, which can alter the combination that you have and essentially your phenotype. So think of an example again, you might have black hair and brown eyes, but through recombination, your kids can end up with brown hair and blue eyes or something like that, some new combination or something like that, where you're mixing around the different alleles. And again, those different combinations, those different phenotypes give something upon which natural selection can operate. All right, so natural selection can favor certain types over another depending on the conditions. And selection can sort of move in different directions, you might say. So if you have a bird population where having a larger beak is favored and there's a shift in the average from a smaller to a larger beak, so it's going in a particular direction, we call this directional selection. All right. Good example you might have seen in the human population in the past has to do with the size of our brain and our skull. There's been strong selection for having a bigger brain and a bigger skull, so that's directional selection. Other times you have stabilizing selection where the mean doesn't change, but you basically select against the extremes and it stabilizes on a particular mean and doesn't really change. A good example of this is birth weight. Um, so if a baby is too small, they tend to not have all their parts, their lungs and stuff developed, and they don't survive as well. And if a baby is too big, then birth can be an issue, and not so much these days with C-sections, but before modern medicine, if the baby was too big, it put the mother and the baby at risk during birth, and so essentially selection favored a particular size baby of about, 7 pounds or so. That's the typical weight of a baby at birth. Um, Now, disruptive selection is when the average is sort of not favored, but the extremes are. And so you might have a situation where the population begins to diverge into two different subgroups. For example, bird beak size, where the birds with smaller beaks are feeding on small seeds and the birds with bigger beaks are feeding on larger seeds. And because of the resource, you either have small or large seeds, not many in the middle, the population starts to diverge or it's being disrupted. You can probably imagine that this situation, if it persists long enough, can result in a situation where you end up with essentially two different phenotypes. And if those phenotypes don't really interact with each other, what can happen, which sort of leads to our next discussion. That is, they can start to become different species. A bird that has a smaller beak and a bird that has a larger beak. We'll talk about speciation in the next video.